There is a moment in the Amazon rainforest when surviving stops being a choice and becomes something else entirely. When the infection has already spread past the wrist. When the nearest anything resembling medical help is 3 days by river. When the decision that has to be made is not whether to act, but whether the person making the act has the knowledge to do it correctly. Amazon tribes have been making that decision for thousands of years. What they do in that moment is not what most people imagine, and it is not what most people could bring themselves to do. The word primitive, when applied to Amazon tribes, reveals more about the person using it than about the people being described. It implies that the practices of these communities are the result of ignorance, that if they only knew better, they would do things differently. What the anthropological record shows, consistently and without ambiguity, is that the darkest practices of Amazon tribal survival are not the result of ignorance. They are the result of knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge of what happens when you do not act, accumulated across generations of watching people die from inaction in an environment that does not offer second chances. The Achuar people of the Ecuadorian and Peruvian Amazon live in one of the most remote inhabited regions of the western rainforest. Their territory spans an area with no road access, no permanent medical infrastructure, and river systems that become impassable during certain seasons. When a member of an Achuar community sustains a serious injury, a deep cut from a machete, a bite from a venomous snake, a wound that becomes infected in the heat and humidity of the jungle floor, the community's response is immediate, systematic, and in several documented cases, extreme by any standard the outside world applies. Ethnographer Philippe Descola, who spent years living with the Achuar and whose fieldwork produced one of the most detailed records of daily life in an Amazon community ever compiled, documented multiple instances of wound management practices that Western medicine would classify as surgical intervention performed without anesthetic, without sterile instruments, and without post-operative care in any conventional sense. What he also documented was the outcome data, the proportion of serious injuries that resulted in survival under this system, in an environment where infection alone kills within days if untreated. The outcomes were not what the word primitive would lead anyone to expect. The reason requires understanding something about the Amazon that most people who have not spent time there do not fully appreciate. The jungle does not merely present the risk of injury, it presents the certainty that any injury, left unmanaged, will become infected. The temperature, the humidity, the density of bacterial and fungal life in the soil and air mean that a wound that would heal without intervention in a temperate climate will begin showing signs of serious infection within 24 to 48 hours in the Amazon. The question is never whether to treat a serious wound. The question is always what treatment is available, and whether the person performing it knows exactly what they are doing. Amazon tribes know exactly what they are doing. They have known for a very long time. The practice of drinking animal blood in Amazon tribes is one of the most consistently misrepresented facts in popular accounts of indigenous life. It is presented, when it is presented at all, as evidence of savagery, a behavior so far outside the boundaries of civilized conduct that it marks these communities as fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. The biological reality is considerably more straightforward. Fresh animal blood is nutritionally dense. It contains protein, iron, electrolytes, and in the context of an extended hunting expedition where food sources have been scarce and physical exertion has been extreme, It represents an immediately available source of nutrients that the body can absorb rapidly. Among the Waorani of the Ecuadorian Amazon, the consumption of blood from freshly killed prey during extended hunts is documented as a specific response to a specific physiological need, not as ritual, not as tradition for its own sake, but as a practical nutritional intervention at the moment when the hunter's body needs immediate fuel to continue functioning. Anthropologist Laura Rival, whose fieldwork with the Waorani spans decades and whose academic work on their subsistence practices is among the most cited in the field, documented this practice in the context of hunts lasting multiple days in deep jungle terrain where carrying sufficient food for the duration was not feasible. The hunters consumed blood not because they preferred it, but because it was available, nutritionally effective, and wasted nothing from an animal that had already been killed. The same logic governs the consumption of insects across virtually every Amazon tribe for which dietary data has been documented. This is not a desperate measure taken when other food sources have failed. It is a deliberate nutritional strategy built into the ordinary diet of communities that understand with precision the protein and fat content of the insect species available in their environment. The larvae of the palm weevil, Rhynchophorus palmarum, are consumed across a wide range of Amazon communities and have been analyzed nutritionally by researchers at multiple Brazilian universities. The results are consistent. The larvae contain protein concentrations comparable to beef, fat profiles that include beneficial unsaturated fatty acids, and caloric density that makes them among the most efficient food sources available in the jungle environment. They are not a fallback. They are a feature of a diet calibrated for the energetic demands of life in the Amazon. What looks from the outside like desperation is, on examination, optimization. The communities that eat insects are not doing so because they cannot find better food. They are doing so because, by the metrics that matter in their environment, caloric efficiency, protein density, availability, and the energy cost of acquisition, insects are among the best food available. The darker practices begin where ordinary nutritional strategy ends, where the injury has already happened, where the infection is already visible, where the decision that nobody wants to make has run out of time. Among several Amazon communities, including documented cases among the Matsiguenca of the Peruvian Amazon, studied by ethnobotanist Glenn Shepard, the treatment of severely infected limbs has historically included interventions that amount to field amputation, the removal of necrotic tissue or, in extreme cases, of entire digits or portions of limbs, performed using available cutting tools, managed with plant-based preparations to slow bleeding and reduce infection, and followed by a recovery process supervised by the community's medical specialist. These are not procedures performed casually. They are performed when the alternative has been assessed and found to be certain death. The ritual burial of living community members is among the most disturbing practices documented in the anthropological literature on Amazon tribes, and among the most misunderstood. The practice, documented in variant forms across several Amazonian and broader South American indigenous communities, involves the partial or complete interment of a seriously ill person in soil for a defined period, under controlled conditions supervised by a shaman or senior healer. From the outside, the description produces an immediate visceral reaction. The reality of what is happening and why is substantially more complex than the image that reaction conjures. Among certain communities of the upper Amazon basin, this practice is applied specifically to cases of severe fever. what the communities identify as the body burning from within. The physiological logic, reconstructed by medical anthropologists who have studied the practice, is grounded in the thermal properties of jungle soil. At a depth of 30 to 50 centimeters below the surface, Amazon soil maintains a temperature consistently several degrees below the ambient air temperature, which in the jungle environment runs high and humid in ways that accelerate the progression of fever-related complications. The partial burial of a feverish patient in cooler soil is, in functional terms, a form of controlled external cooling, the same therapeutic goal pursued by modern fever management protocols that use cooling blankets, ice packs, and temperature-controlled environments. The mechanism is different. The objective is identical. Reduce core body temperature in a patient whose fever has reached levels that threaten neurological function. Researcher Claudia Rodriguez Ferreira, whose work on ethnomedical practices in the Brazilian Amazon was published through the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, documented cases where this practice was applied to patients with malarial fever, a condition that kills through the sustained elevation of core body temperature and the resulting cascade of organ stress. In environments without anti-malarial medication, without intravenous fluid replacement, without any of the pharmacological tools that modern medicine uses to manage severe malaria, the community's options are limited to what the jungle provides. What the jungle provides, it turns out, includes cooler soil. The shaman supervising this treatment is not performing magic. He is performing the most rational intervention available to him, given the tools at hand and the knowledge accumulated by his community across generations of managing the same condition. The spiritual framework surrounding the practice, the prayers, the specific words spoken, the ceremonial elements that accompany the physical intervention, serves a function that modern medicine has only recently begun to formally study. It manages the psychological state of the patient and the community during a medical crisis, reducing panic, maintaining social cohesion, and providing the patient with a framework of meaning that affects their physiological stress response. The placebo effect, in its broadest and most accurately understood form, is not a trick. It is a real physiological phenomenon in which psychological state produces measurable changes in immune function, pain perception, and recovery trajectory. Amazon shamans did not have a name for it. They had something more useful: generations of observation showing that patients who believed they were being effectively treated recovered at higher rates than patients who did not. The question that sits underneath all of these practices, the blood consumption, the insect diet, the field amputations, the fever burials, is the question that the modern world consistently fails to ask seriously when it encounters them. What would you do if you had no other choice? It is easy to classify Amazon tribal survival practices as primitive from a position of complete insulation from the conditions that produce them, from a position where infection is managed with antibiotics available at a pharmacy, where fever is treated with medication that costs less than a meal, where amputation, when necessary, is performed in a sterile environment by a trained surgeon under general anesthetic with post-operative care lasting days or weeks. Remove those options. Place a person in an environment where infection visible this morning will be life-threatening by tomorrow morning, where fever that has been climbing for 2 days has no pharmaceutical intervention available, where a limb showing signs of gangrene is attached to a body that will die if the gangrene spreads, 3 days from the nearest anything that resembles help. Now ask what a rational, caring, knowledgeable community does in that situation. The answer, documented across the anthropological record of Amazon tribes, is that they do exactly what needs to be done. Not casually, not without grief, not without the full weight of what the situation requires pressing on everyone involved. But they do it because the alternative, the compassionate-seeming alternative of doing nothing, of hoping, of waiting, is not compassion in the Amazon. It is a death sentence delivered slowly. Brazilian anthropologist Alcida Rita Ramos, whose decades of work with the Yanomami produced some of the most nuanced academic literature on Amazon indigenous life, wrote that the Western tendency to classify indigenous survival practices as brutal without examining the conditions that produce them reflects a fundamental failure of contextual understanding. The practices are not brutal in a vacuum. They are rational responses to brutal conditions, conditions that the communities did not choose and cannot escape, managed with the knowledge and tools available to them with a consistency and effectiveness that the outcomes, examined honestly, fully support. The Matses hunter who drinks blood from a freshly killed animal on the third day of an exhausting deep jungle expedition is not performing a ritual of savagery. He is fueling his body with the most available and effective nutrient source at the moment his body needs it most. The Acuar healer who removes necrotic tissue from an infected wound using a blade cleaned in fire is not practicing primitive medicine. He is performing the only intervention that will prevent a localized infection from becoming a systemic one in an environment where systemic infection kills within days. The darkness in these practices is not in the communities that developed them. The darkness is in the conditions that made them necessary, and in the persistent refusal of the outside world to look at those conditions honestly before passing judgment on the responses they produced. These tribes did not choose the Amazon. They were born into it as their parents were, and their parents before them, across hundreds of generations. What they built in that time, the knowledge, the practices, the systems for managing the worst that their environment could produce, is not evidence of how far below the modern world they sit. It is evidence of how completely, over thousands of years, human intelligence can adapt to conditions that would defeat almost anyone encountering them for the first time. The Amazon does not care about judgment. It only cares about survival. And these tribes, by every measure that environment applies, have survived it better than anyone else ever has.